welcome to the Author's Pen. I'm Hillary Akers. Today we're going to be talking with Mike Sisak, a reporter with the Citizen's Voice, a Pennsylvania newspaper. We will be discussing his coverage of the Sandusky trial. Hi Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to just jump right in and talk about just multiple things about the Sandusky trial and your coverage of it, starting maybe with your working environments and how they were different with this particular case.
This was a case that really transpired about 2 hours from where I'm located in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Most of the activity that took place in the trial and the arrest and the aftermath at Penn State was on the campus at Penn State and State College. So I spent about 2 weeks up there last November, actually right about a year ago. Today, about 3 days from now will be the one-year anniversary of Jerry Sandusky's arrest on these child sex abuse charges. And then after that, as we all know, Joe Paterno, the football coach, was fired. The president of the university was fired for their mishandling of the allegations. That happened on the Wednesday following the arrest, which happened on a Saturday. There was a riot just off campus. So I was up there for 2 weeks covering that initial phase of it. And you know, you're kind of working on the fly a lot of the time. You're working out of a laptop or off of an iPad. You're texting and tweeting on the go. I happen to be shooting pictures along with writing stories because you know, we have limited resources increasingly in our industry. We're doing some video as well. And then once we got to the trial, you know, it was in a courtroom, so it was kind of more of a set position, if you will. You were in a courtroom. You had the ability to take notes on your laptop, but you still had to find a place to work to write your stories. And a lot of us in the media wound up setting shop at a Dairy Queen across the street from the courthouse. Over that 2 week period of the trial, we might have had a few too many blizzards, but it was well worth it.
Nice. So working specifically, how was it on campus? I'm sure at the time, at the very beginning of the trial, things were very hectic and maybe with the students there was confusion. There was a lot of attention from the media. How was that environment?
It was interesting. It was difficult at times because there was some resentment toward the media from the students. Some of the students and supporters of Joe Paterno and the football program at Penn State felt that the media had fueled this story, that we had made Paterno and the university out to be something that was unfair. Even during the riots on just off campus, I remember I was surrounded at one point by a bunch of students who were, you know, heckling the media, and I told them, I said, look, we're here to report the story, and we're also here to ask questions that you can't necessarily ask. And one of those questions was, it was there justification for Joe Paterno's firing? Because that was a big sticking point with a lot of these students and supporters. They wanted to know why the university would so suddenly dismiss a coach who had meant so much to the school. He had more than 400 wins on the football field. He had donated millions of dollars to the school library. He encouraged academics over athletics. That was his mantra. Whether it was true or not,
Right.
that was his mantra. And so people thought that you know, he brought a lot of renown to the school. Why treat a man like that with such a rush to judgment? Obviously, we know now the university was working off of some evidence that it did not share with us at the time. In their report on their internal investigation that came out in July, there were emails that showed that Joe Paterno had an interest in some investigations into Jerry Sandusky's behavior dating back to 1998. He looked into this, wanted to be kept abreast of it, and it seemed the university back in November decided that he was culpable for not doing more to prevent child abuse on the campus. Now, in a situation like that, you have people who are frustrated, who are emotional, and sometimes they'll redirect their anger not necessarily at the root cause, whether it's their frustration or their anger that they've been betrayed by their idol, their frustration with the university or the legal system, or Jerry Sandusky, who
Right.
is the ultimate villain here. So they'll redirect it at the best target, which sometimes is the media. But you know, we emerged unscathed for the most part. There was a TV van that was turned over during the riots, and then from then on, you know, if you explain to students or supporters that you're there to tell their story as well, many of them were cooperative.
Was there any immediate fears from the students towards you? Any like violent tendencies? Like how was that? I'm sure that was pretty intense.
During that initial time, during that riot, especially, I was a little fearful just because being surrounded by these students who were kind of yelling and heckling. Um, but I was able to talk them down a little bit, and there were police all around, so if anything were to happen, it wouldn't last too long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was at times when you're out there, I was alone for the most part from my organization. Um, you do get into situations where you want to make sure you're not so much fearful of violence or being harmed. You're fearful of missing the story or getting scooped on something. There's so
Right.
many people there that are covering the same thing, and you have a lot of national media. NBC can send in a dozen people to work on a story. We're a relatively small newspaper chain um, in Pennsylvania, and I was the only reporter there for us. So you're trying to find unique angles, and sometimes you might go down the wrong avenue. You might encounter somebody who might not be as willing to cooperate,
Mm-hmm.
and you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to kind of overcome your own sort of limitations that way. But nothing too violent, nothing too fearful on the as far as physical confrontation goes. We were lucky in that regard.
Right. How is the environment different when you went to the courtroom scene and outside the courtroom and all of that?
Well, the courtroom, for the most part, during the trial was controlled. You had the sheriff's department there. You have law enforcement. There were reserved seats for the media inside the courtroom, and then you had people from the outside that could come in. It's a public trial, so people from the community
Mm-hmm.
could come in and witness that as well.
Right.
And it was very fascinating to be in the courtroom because you're the eyes and ears for all your readers, all your viewers. You have to bring them into an environment that they don't necessarily have a seat in.
Mm-hmm.
So you're one of the fortunate people to see Jerry Sandusky up close, to be a few feet away from him, to talk to him during intermission or recess, I should say, and you have to kind of process all that and bring it out to your readers and viewers. It was a controlled environment in the courtroom. And relatively calm, good working environment, typical courtroom setting like you might see on television or in the movies. When the verdict came in, which was on a Friday night in June,
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of chaotic outside. What happened was the judge, in his best judgment, he decided that nobody in the courtroom, none of the media, were going to send out the verdict in advance before court adjourned because
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to make sure the security was in place. He didn't want anybody fighting to get the news out first. He wanted everybody to understand what the verdict was,
Mm-hmm.
and then once court was adjourned at 10:30 p.m., he would allow you to go and disseminate the news.
Right.
Well, that happened. The verdict came in. The charges were read. 45 guilty verdicts on 48 counts. 3 not guilty verdicts. Once the court is adjourned, reporters start rushing out the doors, down the stairs, an old-style courtroom, so the courthouse.
Mm-hmm.
So the courtroom is on the second floor. People rush down the stairs, out the door. None of the people outside, and there were a considerable number of them. There were several hundred people that had come from the community, from the Penn State community, from State College, from Bellefonte, from surrounding towns, on the courthouse square to see this verdict. It was something out of like the Wild West,
Yeah.
where you have a public hanging sort of about to unfold, and everyone from the village comes out. Once the word spread that the people started shouting that he had been convicted, a loud cheer went up,
Mm-hmm.
and there was sort of a sense of relief in the community. One legal analyst I talked to said it was kind of a disgusting display because regardless, you still have child abuse and you still have a man's life that's ultimately on the line in the criminal justice system, and it was sort of this public execution that was happening on the courthouse lawn. That said, that was sort of the one time when things maybe got a little out of hand because you had this other element, this hundreds of people that were just kind of coming in, and it was sort of a mob mentality. But that dissipated eventually. There was some press conferences out. There were some press conferences outside. The lawyers for Jerry Sandusky were heckled to the point where they had to leave the podium. But other than that, there was no violence. There was nothing sinister that happened.
I see. Let's talk about your deadlines because this case did go on for so long. And especially in the beginning, it was such a big case. How are your deadlines? Were they immediate? How are you working on deadlines?
Oh, deadline was a crunch at the early stages of this. We were actually, our newspaper was going through some modifications on our press equipment, the equipment that prints the newspaper. So we had early deadlines to begin with. I think our last pages had to be out at 10 p.m. And the night that this unfolded, and then the night that Joe Paterno was fired, the Penn State Board of Trustees didn't make that announcement until after 10 o'clock. They had a press conference, and it was about 10:15, 10:30 by the time that they announced that. So I had a story that I had written about Joe Paterno's seeming earlier in the day. He went to his last, he went to practice. It turned out to be his last practice, and I had the framework of a kind of could be adjusted if he was fired or if he resigned. In fact, that day he had announced that he was going to retire here, so we had some background on his career and different things that you normally put in a story like that. And then as hell started breaking loose after 10 o'clock, our editor approved our ability to update that page, that story, every half hour until the press run was over. So we were able to get updated news as it happened throughout the night, and I was kind of on my computer, like sending back, 5-6 paragraphs about what was going on in the press conference, the firing, the riots. Paterno was at his house. He was cheerleading on students. At one point, he says, "Don't worry about me. Worry about yourselves. Worry about your studies. Worry about this university." He was kind of resigned to the fact that he had been fired, but wasn't showing any ill will toward the university. As that progressed, then into the trial, we had a normal deadline, but again, you had a deadline situation when the verdict came in, because that came in after 10 o'clock, 10:30. Our deadline at that point had been moved to around 11, but still, to get a comprehensive story, reaction from the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the victims' families that might have been in the courtroom, to get the scene that happened in the courtroom. It was this very chaotic experience, but sometimes chaos forces you to focus and forces you to create a sharper story than you otherwise would. You have a day or two to work on it. It's sort of like when you're in school, or you're working on a paper. You have a whole week to work on something. You're going to take your time, and you might procrastinate.
Right.
When you have, when it's midnight before the deadline at 9 a.m., you're going to focus. You're going to get something done.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how it was when we were up against the deadlines during this whole process.
And recently, with the new news that has come up with this, how have your deadlines been?
Same thing. Most of the stuff that's happened has happened early in the day, so that's good. We have to be cognizant as well of online and social media. So in that regard, there's really no deadline. There's always a deadline. You're with the sentencing or with the trial even. When we had opportunities to, we would send updates out on Twitter. We'd post online updates. We would do some video stuff at the end of the day. That would go up around 6 o'clock. You're trying to feed all your audiences, and it's not just that print deadline at 10 or 11 o'clock that you're focused on anymore. The good thing about all of that, the Twitter and the online media, is that once you write an online update during the trial, I found this. You pick out the key moments of the morning session. There were 2 sessions during the trial. The morning, and then you'd break for lunch, and then you'd have the afternoon. And what I found was that you'd pick out the key stuff that happened in the morning, and maybe there was something that there was some argument about evidence or something that maybe warranted its own story. And then you had a key witness that testified, and then you had something that maybe you learned from a source that fit into the trial, whether it's who was going to testify tomorrow, or what was going on with Jerry Sandusky's son who made allegations, that sort of thing. And you would already have the framework of that story set up because you've written an online update. So now you can just, at the end of the day, when you're done with the trial, go back to that and add to it rather than having to create a whole story from scratch. And that was very useful and very vital to getting everything done on time.
Right. And you're talking about using social media, so let's talk about convergence. And today, there's videos. If you're working newspaper, you have to be able to shoot video, shoot still pictures, because you put things online, you put things in print. Talk about how did you decide what things were so important that they needed to be out immediately, and what details you saved for print versions?
Usually, if there was something that was going on that everyone was going to have at some point anyway, we would break it online or we'd put it online. There's a thirst, especially during trials. There's a thirst for instant knowledge, and you're going up against not only other newspapers, other online sources, but television. The former Court TV, I think it's called True TV now. They set up a mobile studio outside the courthouse, and they were doing constant updates. CNN was on constantly. Some of the other networks, ABC was there, NBC, CBS, all the local affiliates. So you want to you want to position yourself on any story, but you want to position yourself as a go-to news source for this particular trial, this coverage.
Right.
So you want to get whatever news that people can get elsewhere, you want to break out first on your own site. Whether that's, hey, Jerry Sandusky's wife is going to testify this afternoon, or Mike McQuarrie, who's the assistant coach that walked into the shower room and saw Jerry with a young boy back in 2001. He's going to be on the stand. We're getting information that he's going to be on the stand, or we've learned that X, Y, and Z has happened. Eventually somebody else is going to have that. Now, the things that you're going to hold on to for print or to break online when nobody else can get them, those are the things that you maybe have worked on, fleshed out on your own. Maybe that's stuff that you've obtained some evidence or emails. Or I did a story about how Joe Paterno's will. He passed away in January, and the family filed his will with the courthouse, and it was sealed. Nobody could get a look at it to see what was in it. And that's okay. I mean, he's entitled to his privacy, but under the law, wills are supposed to be public documents. They're public records. And I looked and saw that there were 800 and something wills that were filed in Center County. Center County, where Joe Paterno lived, and none of them were sealed. None of them were kept private except for his. So I wrote this story. I talked to some experts, and it was an exclusive thing that nobody else had seen that was sealed. Now, it wasn't really that big a deal. In fact, the family made it more of a big deal by sealing the will, because once it was unsealed, all it said was, "I'm leaving everything to my wife."
Yeah.
So it didn't seem to be that big a deal. Why if they had just left it unsealed, it wouldn't be a big story. But because there was that secrecy and there was this veil of secrecy over Penn State, people thought, well, something's going on here, and we need to read this and react to it.
I see. And generally, with this case, you were by yourself, correct?
Yeah, I was by myself. There were a couple other reporters up early on to cover the riots and the firing, and to help out on the first football game that happened right after Joe Paterno's firing. Was against Nebraska about 10 days after Jerry Sandusky's arrest.
Right.
But then after that, I was on my own, and I was kind of leading the way on this for our paper. Another example, by the way, for sort of, this is where the social media hybrid comes into play. In November, I reported that Joe Paterno had been treated at a medical facility for an undisclosed illness. The next day, that report was then picked up by the Associated Press. The next day, the family disclosed that he was battling cancer. Fast forward to January, I get word from a source that Joe Paterno is dying. He's in his final hours. His family is inviting close friends, to come and say goodbye. And at that point, because it was so pressing, I broke it on Twitter and online. And then the next day we had a full story in the paper. And that's an area where you can break news and then also follow up on it in the paper.
Right.
And the interesting thing about breaking news on social media or online is that it then gets picked up by a lot of other sources.
Right.
So you better be doubly sure that you're correct in your information. There was a snafu that night where a student-run publication at Penn State had already reported that Paterno died. That didn't happen until the next morning, and they caught a lot of flack for that. So in the age of social media, you need to be doubly sure, especially when you're working alone or working on a story that you have limited resources on. If you're breaking something, make sure it's not too good to be true.
Right, definitely. Since you were a one-man band, were you taking pictures? Were you shooting video during this? What was that?
Early on, I did. I shot pictures the first 2 weeks of this. When things were going on that were visual in nature. Joe Paterno's last practice, him coming out of his house, some of the riots, the riot that Wednesday, the press conference with the Board of Trustees, where they fired Paterno and Spanier, the president. I have sort of a I guess, an interest in the visual medium as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was shooting a lot of pictures, and we were doing some video stuff we were putting online. We were doing some raw video, some slideshows. And then once the trial came around, I did like a daily stand-up that was kind of a recap, a 2-3 minute recap of the trial. And I worked with our friends at the local television station here. It's an NBC affiliate that we do some work with, and they helped out a great deal by giving me a sort of professional broadcast look to the video. Then we'd edit in some photos, some audio from the day,
Mm-hmm.
anything that might have come out soundbite wise outside the courthouse, and put together a news package for our readers and visitors to our website that might not have the ability or the time to read all the stories or to follow along with all of the developments in the trial. This gave them an opportunity to get a quick synopsis on what happened, and it was a visual medium as well, and that is again part of the convergence where you're sort of bringing the newspaper and the online experience alive for them.
Mm-hmm. What about being in the courtroom? I'm sure there's a lot of legal jargon that not we don't necessarily understand as viewers. We don't understand exactly what's going on. How do you make your story relatable and understandable?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've covered courts for a while. I've been at this newspaper almost 5. I've covered courts for about four or so. Some big corruption trials up here with judges who are accused of sending kids to jail for profit. Basically, they were taking kickbacks. So you get a lot of this legal jargon that comes up in these trials: murder trial, kidnapping, sexual assault trials, that sort of thing. And you kind of develop in your brain, in your mind, you get the shorthand of what that actually means to the reader. And when in doubt, you have in a trial like this, there were legal experts in the courtroom. There was Wes Oliver, who was working for NBC News, and he's a professor at a local law school. He was great at deciphering some of this stuff for our readers. He allowed us to interview him, every day if we so chose. And you also have a stable of people that you cover on a regular basis back home.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some prosecutors and some defense attorneys in this area that I would turn to interpret some of the things that happened in the courtroom. And you have legal jargon, you have developments, you have closed sessions behind closed doors, and you want to give your reader the full picture of what's happening. And there were many times throughout the trial where I would turn to these experts or rely on the knowledge that I've gained to really boil it down to simple terms that everyone can understand, because not everyone goes to law school or sits in a courtroom for a trial for many weeks.
Right. You talked about the story that you did about Joe Paterno's will, but what other angles did you take on this story? Because obviously there was many stations and newspapers covering this story. What was going through your head, and how did you decide I'm going to go this way with it so it's a little bit different?
You try to make friends. The first thing that you do, you make friends. Hopefully long before anything major happens. It's sort of, you have to be lucky in that regard. I covered Penn State football, over the years. I've done some work up there, and you get to know people in the various offices at the school, various people that are connected to different parts of the institution. And that comes in handy when you're covering a story like this, because you are outmanned. NBC has 12, 15 people there, all the other networks. So you look for angles that you can accomplish. You don't want to cover everything. You don't want to be chasing all the stuff that's already being broken. You want to be able to cover the areas that you can get your hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, if you have people that in the football office, or people that work in the university, even just checking court records and finding that will story. That was an important piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Early on, I did a story about Jerry Sandusky's adopted son, Matt, who had violence issues.
Mm-hmm.
And he became a possible key witness in the trial.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found that story about his violence based on finding court records on him, arrest records, and some protection from abuse orders, restraining orders that were filed against him. Mining records, and then mining the resources that you have in that area. I had a person that I know up there who said, that he was told by a nurse at the hospital that Joe Paterno was being treated for this illness.
Mm-hmm.
We verified that. and we saw actually video on a local television station of Paterno leaving the infirmary on campus that day with a man in a lab coat, white, looking like a doctor. So that was, that we kind of put that together just based on a tip from somebody that we knew up there. And then the same thing happened when Paterno was dying. And you also, need to befriend in a way, not befriend like you're going to go out and have them at your party or whatever,
Right.
but get to know people in the legal community, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys. I've texted back and forth here and there with some of the attorneys on the case, just trying to get some information or to try to establish something for down the road. And then there are attorneys that are representing the victims, and they're privy to a lot of information as well. And we had a story a couple weeks ago on victim 2, who was the boy in the shower that nobody has really identified yet. He was the boy that assistant coach Mike McQuarrie saw with Jerry Sandusky back in 2001. There are a pair of lawyers in Philadelphia who say that he has come forward now, and they are representing him. And they disclosed to me that this shower incident wasn't the only incident. There were many, many more incidents that happened on the Penn State campus with Jerry Sandusky. The university didn't do anything about Jerry Sandusky, and they allowed this abuse to continue for months and months and months. And that's all just based on having a conversation or a relationship with people that know what's going on.
Right, definitely. How has this case, working on this case, been different for you, and what have you learned? I mean, obviously having a career this far into it and then doing something like this, is there any lessons that you learned or things that you had to face that you hadn't before?
Sure. I mean, there's part of it is going to sound like, I guess, stupid or selfish, but part of it is once you get back to your normal grind in your local county courthouse or your local beat, there is a little bit of a hangover effect, I guess, or a letdown, because for 2 weeks or for a year, really, this has been going on. But for the 2 weeks of the trial, you're standing side by side with Armin Katayan of CBS News or Michael Isikoff of NBC or some of the other big time reporters that have worked on these stories, their whole careers. The great thing about it is that you're able to measure yourself against those people. You're able to see what you have in your story or your video report or your online presentation that is better or worse than them. The New York Times covered this story, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, radio stations, television stations from across the country.
Right.
So it really is a great benchmark for what kind of work you do, coming from the Citizen's Voice in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. That was the best lesson to me. It really made me appreciate all the hard work of my colleagues and also understand the process that goes into covering these things on a national basis. And it makes you better. Anything that you learn from anything like this makes you better.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much again for speaking with us and for shedding light on how it is to be involved in something like this. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And thank you for joining us. And this has been the Author's Pen.